In this presentation, we're going to look at adaptations to life on land, and we're going to focus on the major adaptive problems that address the characteristics of terrestrial environments. So first, one of the major differences between terrestrial and aquatic environments is that organisms that are mostly water are surrounded by dry air on land instead of water, as they would be in an aquatic habitat. So water conservation is very important to terrestrial animals and plants. Second, they are exposed to solar radiation in ways that they are not exposed to it in aquatic habitats, and that produces extra heat loading that they have to deal with. And finally, because water is a buffered environment, because it has a high heat capacity, it doesn't change temperature very much. In contrast, terrestrial habitats that have air as the medium heat up and cool down to a much greater degree. So animals that live on land have to have adaptations for tolerating greater swings in temperature than they would find in aquatic environments. Now, that means that the two major adaptive problems that all terrestrial organisms face are conservation of water and maintenance of heat balance. So we'll take conservation of water first. We'll first look at obtaining water and nutrients from the soil by plants, and then look at how transpiration in plants helps them accomplish this. We'll then move to osmoregulation and water conservation in plants and animals, looking at the different adaptations that they have for conserving water on land. And finally, we'll look at the very specific problem of photosynthesis, which can use a lot of water and which plants modify in order to conserve water when necessary. So first, let's talk about how plants get nutrients and water out of soil. It's important to understand that the greater the surface area that soil particles have, the more water that those particles can hold, and the tighter they hold water. So sand is the coarsest, silt is intermediate, clay is the finest. And here's a comparison of sand versus silt versus clay. And down here you have a little diagram that tries to explain how surface area is related to water retention. So here in this silt panel on the left, you see that water is bound to the surface of the silt, but look, there's relatively little surface area of this silt particle compared to its mass. So it holds only a small amount of water. Also, the packing of silt particles means that there are large air spaces in between, and that promotes drainage of water out of soil. In contrast, the clay that you see here on the right has much greater surface area for the mass of the clay particles, means it can hold much more water and hold it more tightly. And you see much less airspace in this clay, meaning that water doesn't drain out of clay very easily. So the characteristics of the soil particles in which a plant finds itself determine the challenges that it needs to face. If it's in a sandy soil where drainage is good, its roots will get a lot of air, a lot of oxygen, but water may be limiting because not much water is held tightly in sandy soil and it drains easily. On the other hand, in clay, it may be very difficult to get water away from the clay particles because the surface tension of water in clay is quite high, and clay holds that water very tightly. So plants may have a much harder time getting the water out of clay soils than out of sandy soils, but there is more water to be had in clay soils. So the way that this is accomplished is through manipulating solute concentrations in the roots. If root cells have high solute concentrations, they can achieve a high osmotic pressure, and they can draw water away from the surface of the soil particles. They can basically have more power to draw the water from the soil than the soil has to hold the water through surface tension. So, as water moves into the root from the surrounding soil, it then dilutes the solutes in the root. And that then sets up a concentration gradient between the ions inside, which are now diluted, and the ions outside in the soil, which are more concentrated. And the ions in the soil will passively move into the root to equalize the osmotic gradient. Now, roots tend to have semi-permeable membranes that prevent large molecules from leaving, like glucose, which is required for metabolism. And so not all soil ions that a plant wants will automatically be able to move in. Some of the larger molecules may have to be actively transported. Plants will also invest extra energy in active transport under certain conditions. If plants are growing in dry areas, they may have to actively transport ions into soil, from the soil into the cells to increase the osmotic gradient and draw water out of the soil. And if they grow in salty environments, they will have to increase the concentration of solutes in their roots to a point that exceeds the concentration of salt outside the roots. So plants may have to manipulate the solute concentrations of their roots to achieve water absorption and nutrient absorption. Now, what we just described implies that at some point, as water moves into roots, followed by the ions that the plant wants to get into the roots, the osmotic gradient will equalize across the semi-permeable membrane of the root, and you'll have equal osmotic pressure inside and outside, at which point the plant will no longer be able to draw water and ions out of the soil and into the body of the plant. Somehow it will have to manipulate the water concentration to restore an osmotic gradient where there's higher concentrations of solutes inside the cells than outside. It does this by transpiring water out of the leaves. So transpiration moves water from the roots through the plant to the leaves, where it evaporates out of the stomata on the leaf. And that removes water from inside the plant, increasing the solute concentration and restoring the osmotic potential of roots, allowing it to absorb more water and more ions. So transpiration is driven by evaporation from leaf surfaces, and that is accomplished not by generally indiscriminate evaporation, but through special openings called stomata, which deliberately expose the moist tissues of the inside of the leaf to the dry outside air, facilitating evaporation. The way that it works is that once water arrives in the leaves, it's hydrogen bonded to a continuous column of water molecules all the way down the stem of the plant and into the roots. And so as water is removed from the leaf, it pulls that continuous column of water up through the stem. Leaves are coated with waterproofing to ensure that most evaporation happens through the stomata, which can be tightly controlled. Now, what are the adaptations for reducing indiscriminate water loss in plants and animals? We just mentioned that plants protect their leaves so that they don't lose water indiscriminately and only lose it through the stomata where it's controlled. Well, let's investigate plants first. You'll recall that there's such a thing as a boundary layer. And in a boundary layer, in the aquatic habitat, it's an area of still fluid next to a surface, And we said that was a problem for aquatic plants because they can exhaust the CO2 and carbonate in the boundary layer because the water is not moving. Well, on land, a boundary layer of air that is not moving next to a leaf surface can become saturated with water vapor through passive evaporation from the leaf surface. And once that happens, the gradient between the dry outside air and the moist inside of the leaf becomes much lower. And air pulls much less water out of the leaf if the air is saturated with water already. So, one adaptation that plants use is to create a large boundary layer on the surfaces of their leaves by using hairs and spines. And what you see here is a plant that traps a layer of air next to the leaf so that it becomes saturated with water vapor through passive evaporation. And then water simply doesn't passively move out of the leaf very much. The only losses that this leaf will suffer is through the stomata when they are opened. Other kinds of adaptations include waterproofing and reduction in leaf area. Here you see 3 desert plants that take different approaches. You have mesquite and palo verde and jatropha. Mesquite and palo verde have these tiny little leaves, and they also have green stems. Now, the tiny little leaves reduce the area through which water loss occurs. The green stems ensure that some photosynthesis occurs in the stems rather than the leaves. And the stems are protected from water loss by much thicker and tougher plant tissues. An alternative adaptation to minimizing water loss in arid land plants is to simply drop your leaves when you are experiencing arid conditions and only produce leaves during a rainy season, for instance. So here's a plant called Phocuria splendens from the Sonoran Desert, and it's one of the extremes of leaf flushing and leaf dropping. At the top you see this plant in the midsummer in the Sonoran Desert during the rainy season, and you can see that it's kind of green, and it's got flowers. That's because there's moisture in the soil to power photosynthesis. During the winter, when it's dry in that desert, it drops its leaves and so conserves water that way. In animals, some of the same adaptations are seen, and there is also an additional problem that they have in the form of disposal of nitrogen wastes. So we can see analogous adaptations in morphology in animals to those that we saw in plant leaves. Animals can waterproof their skins. Insects use waterproof cuticle to minimize water loss on their exoskeletons. Birds and mammals have hair and feathers that insulate them and produce a very large boundary layer that becomes saturated with water vapor and reduces evaporative loss. They also use countercurrent condensation in the respiratory system. This is a bit different than what we've been talking about when we talk about countercurrent circulation. In countercurrent condensation, animals breathe in dry, cool air. And as it passes over the mucous membranes of the respiratory system, it absorbs heat from the body, and because it's warming, it can absorb water. It also absorbs moisture from the mucous membranes. When it's exhaled, it is warm and moist, and as it passes over the progressively cooler tissues on the way out of the respiratory system, the air also cools. And as it cools, water condenses back on the mucous membrane surfaces. So you recycle the water from the mucous membranes. It goes into the inspired air, and it condenses out of the expired air, and with very little net loss. Finally, animals have a luxury that plants do not. They can move. And so they regularly do move to seek out environments that minimize their water stress. Now, in terms of dealing with nitrogen wastes, there are really 2 strategies. You can reclaim water through the kidney or through the analogous structure in insects. Or you can choose a nitrogen waste product that uses either lots of water or very little water to be eliminated from the body. So first let's look at the reclamation of water in the loop of Henle. Here we have 3 mammals, and they experience different levels of water stress. The beaver is semi-aquatic, and it is surrounded by water. It takes in a lot of water. And notice that it has a relatively small loop of Henle. The rabbit is a fully terrestrial animal. It experiences a bit more water stress, and its loop of Henle is longer. The kangaroo rat lives in extremely dry deserts and persistently experiences water stress, and it has an amazingly long loop of Henle. What is the significance of the loop of Henle? This is the area that is available to actively transport water out of the urine and back into the bloodstream. So you can see that the beaver that experiences very little water stress is not really worried about reclaiming water and can produce a dilute urine with no trouble at all. Rabbits need to be a little more careful, and they reclaim more water because their loop of Henle is longer. Kangaroo rats have an extreme osmotic gradient at the tip of the loop of Henle and reclaim nearly all the water from their urine and produce a very concentrated urine that can verge on the powdery at times. So you can reclaim different amounts of water in the loop of Henle in the kidney, or you can actually choose a nitrogen waste product that requires either more water or less water. Now, ammonia in mammals is the primary waste product of nitrogen metabolism. It gets converted to urea first and then to uric acid. And these wastes differ greatly in solubility. Ammonia is highly soluble, urea is less so, and uric acid is almost crystalline. Now, ammonia is very soluble, but it's also highly toxic. So animals that have a lot of ammonia circulating in their blood and that excrete ammonia need to excrete it in a very dilute urine, using lots of water to minimize the toxicity of ammonia. If you want to be a little more conservative with your water budget, then investing energy to convert ammonia to urea is a better bet, because you use much less water to discard urea than ammonia, and it's for a nominal energy cost. If you're really concerned about water more than energy, then you'll invest much more energy to convert ammonia to urea and then urea to uric acid. The benefit of this is that uric acid requires almost no water to be excreted and can be excreted as a virtual solid. Okay, to finish off this section on adaptations to water conservation, we're going to talk about the 3 photosynthetic systems that plants have. So let's review the basics of photosynthesis before we tackle these 3 systems. First, remember that photosynthesis uses solar energy, which is captured in these thylakoid membranes in what we call the light reactions, where photons interact with light-sensitive pigments. And the energy that is captured in these light reactions is used to bind hydrogen to NADP and phosphate to NADP to form NADPH and ATP. These are the power sources that are used to then join carbon dioxide and water molecules into glucose molecules, producing the waste product of oxygen. Okay, the light reactions are prepping the energy sources, and the dark reactions, or Calvin cycle, is the set of reactions that actually takes the energy and uses it to bind a molecule of carbon dioxide into a, a, a 3-carbon sugar that is then used to make glucose. Okay, so we have light reactions, you have dark reactions, also called the Calvin cycle. Now, let's look at some of the parts of this Calvin cycle. So you've got carbon dioxide here being absorbed from the space inside the stoma, and you have a 5-carbon sugar called RUBP, ribulose bisphosphate, and the enzyme that joins CO2 to ribulose bisphosphate is called ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase, or Rubisco. And in fact, what happens is it takes this single carbon, adds it to the 5-carbon sugar, and then makes 2 3-carbon molecules here. This is glycerol 3-phosphate. So that's the basics of photosynthesis. This should all be a review. And let's then consider this Calvin cycle in a little bit more detail. So the Calvin cycle is universal in plants. All plants that undergo photosynthesis use the carbon cycle. However, some plants use only the carbon cycle, whereas other plants use an additional set of reactions to make the Calvin cycle more efficient. So the types of plants that have these additional reactions are called C4 plants, and they're typically grasses, and CAM plants, crassulacean acid metabolism plants, and that's named after the family in which it's found, the Crassulaceae, which is a family of broad-leaved herbs that are found in relatively arid conditions. Okay, so the basic thing that happens in C3 photosynthesis, which is what occurs in most plants, is that Rubisco, ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase, takes this carbon, adds it to RUBP, and forms 2 3-carbon sugars. So it's 3 carbons. That's why we call it C3 photosynthesis. And so here's the schema here. This enzyme, Rubisco, ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase, is a really interesting enzyme, and it has the advantage of being able to drive photosynthesis. It also has some disadvantages that pop up in particular environmental conditions. So what are they? Well, first off, Rubisco, which is what we'll call this enzyme, has a relatively low affinity for CO2. So in order to drive photosynthesis, you have to have lots of CO2 in your tissues. And that means that you have to open your stomata a lot so that lots of CO2 will diffuse from the outside air into your cells. If you open your stomata to let CO2 in, you let water out. There's no getting around it, so it's a trade-off. The perverse thing about Rubisco is that it also binds to CO2 and can be used to drive the reaction in reverse, taking carbohydrate and breaking it back down into CO2 and water and absorbing energy in the process. So when do you get this? You get it when oxygen concentrations are high. Now, when do oxygen concentrations get elevated for plants? Well, it's generally in hot and dry conditions, because in hot, dry conditions, plants close their stomata. And that means not only can't get CO2 in, the waste product of photosynthesis, which is oxygen, can't diffuse out. So it builds up in the tissues, drives photosynthesis in reverse, and under hot, dry conditions, C3 plants lose much of the energy that they gained in photosynthesis in the first place. This process of driving the photosynthetic reactions backwards is called photorespiration, and it makes C3 plants very inefficient in hot and dry conditions, and they can actually lose energy. So, an alternative pathway has developed in which plants add on an entire set of reactions to make the Calvin cycle more insulated from the outside air and more efficient. It comes at a cost, though, so let's explain how this differs and what the cost is. So in C4 photosynthesis, we separate the light reactions and the dark reactions in different cells. This gives you an advantage in hot and dry conditions because you don't ever build up high amounts of oxygen in the cell in which you're doing photosynthesis. So the way that it works is that you have two sets of cells in C4 plants. You have mesophyll cells and you have bundle sheath cells. The extra set of reactions is found in the mesophyll cells, which are the cells that are adjacent to the stoma. So they're the ones that are in contact with the open air. The bundle sheath cells are deep inside the leaf and they are protected. So in C4 photosynthesis, CO2 is not bound to rubisco from the atmosphere. Instead, it's bound to a different molecule, phosphoenol pyruvate, which is a 3-carbon compound, and it's used to produce a 4-carbon compound called oxaloacetic acid. The enzyme that does this is PEP carboxylase, phosphoenol pyruvate carboxylase. The good thing about phosphoenol pyruvase carboxylase is that it has a higher affinity for CO2 than rubisco. So you can drive photosynthesis at lower levels of CO2, and you don't have to keep your stoma open quite as long. Now, in the C4 pathway, you get this oxaloacetic acid absorbing the CO2 from the atmosphere. It's converted to malic acid and transported into the special bundle sheath cells where the CO2 is split off, pyruvate is regenerated and transferred back into the mesophyll cell. And then CO2 that's liberated gets fed right into the Calvin cycle just as it would be in C3 photosynthesis. So you can accumulate a whole lot of CO2 in these bundle sheath cells by driving the capture of CO2 in the mesophyll cells, and you can build up CO2 in here and keep the photosynthesis reaction driving forwards rather than backwards. And it's much more efficient in hot, dry conditions because for a given amount of carbon dioxide, you can build up much higher concentrations in these bundle sheath cells than you can in regular C3 photosynthesis, and continue to photosynthesize much longer before photorespiration starts to kick in and drive the reaction into reverse. So this sounds like it's a great adaptation, right? But there is a cost. First off, you cut the amount of tissue that's available to host the Calvin reaction, the Calvin cycle, by a considerable amount. There's a lot less tissue doing Calvin reactions in C4 plants. Second, it takes extra energy to run these extra reactions here. So some of the ATPs that you generate from photosynthesis and the formation of sugars have to get recycled and used for these reactions. So you're losing in two ways in terms of energy. You're not making as much energy because there's much less tissue doing the energy making. Second, some of the energy that you do make has to power the extra reactions. Nonetheless, in hot, dry conditions, because you can accumulate large amounts of CO2 in the interior of the leaf, well away from the stoma, you can drive photosynthesis much much farther and much harder than you can in C3 plants that have to shut down their stomata quickly, and O2 builds up very fast. Okay, the second arid land pathway is CAM metabolism, or crassulacean acid metabolism, and it doesn't separate these reactions spatially. It separates them in terms of time. So the light reactions happen during the day, and the dark reactions happen during the night. And the absorption of CO2 occurs during the night. Why is that an advantage? Because at night, humidity is higher, because the temperature is lower. And so you can open your stomata only at night to absorb CO2, and the gradient between the moist inside of the leaf and the dry air is much less. You lose a lot less water. What's the downside to this? Well, you still lose a lot of energy, and because you're packing cells with extra reactions, you're still losing some amount of tissue. But the big thing is that you're only able to accumulate carbon dioxide at night. So you're limited in the amount of time during the day when you're able to drive these reactions. So CAM metabolism produces even less net energy than C4 metabolism, but in really dry deserts, for broad-leaved plants that might otherwise not be able to survive, it is a very effective adaptation for conserving water. So the upshot is you find C3 plants in relatively cool and wet conditions. C4 plants and CAM plants are found in hotter and drier conditions because they're more effective at conserving water. Okay, let's then check out some of the other adaptations that animals have for water balance before we move on to temperature control. Let's look at kangaroo rats, which live in very dry deserts. They drink almost nothing, and they get around this by their large kidneys, by being active nocturnally when the humidity is highest, and oh, by the way, they can make metabolic water from metabolizing the carbohydrates in the seeds that they eat. So as they digest the seeds, the reactions release water, and that is how they stay hydrated. They reclaim all the water they can using their loop of Henle. They make their own water from their food, and they avoid losing lots of water by being night active. Down here at the bottom, you have marine iguana, and you'll recall that mangrove plants had salt glands. Well, marine iguanas have salt glands too. They live in coastal habitats. There's no fresh water for them to drink. They have to drink salt water, so they excrete the salt in special glands. Now let's move on to talk about the second major adaptive problem, and that's maintaining a stable thermal regime. So if you're on land, you gain and lose heat in a number of ways. You can gain or lose heat by radiation, which is emitting electromagnetic energy, and that's what you feel when you're standing directly in the sun. The sun's warming you by radiation. You can also gain or lose by conduction, in which two substances are in contact with one another. Two solids usually is how we think of that. Okay. You can gain or lose energy through convection, and convection is transfer of energy from a solid to a fluid. And this is the reason why aquatic habitats are so challenging for animals to maintain high body temperatures. Convection of heat from inside the body to the surrounding water is very effective and just steals the heat from the body. And finally, animals and plants can lose heat primarily through evaporation. That's the radiant, um, that's the release of energy through the change in state of water from a liquid to a gas. And that removes heat from a surface. Now, average temperatures pose a different problem from changing temperatures. And remember, in aquatic systems, the average temperature is pretty stable. On land, because you gain and lose heat in so many ways, uh, and because the environment itself varies in temperature, it's much harder for this to happen in terrestrial organisms. So animals can tolerate heat in a number of ways. They can have light-colored reflective surfaces. That's the same concept of albedo as we saw in the heat budget of the Earth. They frequently use evaporative cooling. Plants transpire through stomata. Animals pant for the most part, and humans sweat. Humans are the only animals that do any substantial amount of sweating. And finally, you can just go inactive during hot conditions, and that lowers your metabolic costs. If you can afford to do it, it's a very effective way of coping with heat. Animals and plants can be cold tolerant by simply avoiding the issue. Deciduous plants can drop their leaves. Conifers don't drop their leaves, but they do increase their solute concentration so their leaves don't freeze. And animals can avoid cold through hibernation or migration. Or they can tolerate cold from insulation and metabolic heat generation. So, let's investigate a little bit more. Thermoregulation is the ability of an organism to control the temperature of its body. Animals have much greater thermoregulatory control than plants. Not all animals have substantial thermoregulatory control. Homeotherms are organisms that maintain constant temperature, and that allows their biochemical reactions to adapt to a relatively predictable constant temperature. But it's incredibly energy expensive to maintain your temperature just so. Poikilotherms are organisms that don't have a constant body temperature. That's not quite the same as the distinction between ectotherms and endotherms. Ectotherms are organisms that allow their body temperatures to be determined by the external environment. Endotherms generate metabolic heat to raise their body temperature higher than the external environment. Now, some homeotherms, well, basically all homeotherms are endotherms, but some poikilotherms can also be endothermic. They can generate a certain amount of heat even though their body temperatures are not constant. So homeotherm, poikilotherm is not exactly the same as ectotherm, endotherm. Homeotherm is constant, poikilotherm is variable. Ectotherm is determined by the outside environment, endotherm, endogenous heat production, whether or not it results in a constant temperature. Okay, now let's talk about ectotherms a bit. They tend to be organisms with relatively low metabolic rates or small body sizes. They often use behavioral means of altering their body temperatures. They'll orient to the sun if they're cold. They'll orient away from the sun if they're too hot. They'll hunker down on warm substrates to warm up, and they'll lift their bodies up away from those substrates if they get too hot. And so here's an example. Here's some turtles basking. This is something you could see at the Audubon Zoo on a cold day in January or February very frequently. Endotherms are like birds and mammals, and we are the classic endothermic animals. And we maintain internal temperatures somewhere from the mid-30s to the low 40s. And the environment around us varies from plus 50 degrees centigrade to minus 50 degrees centigrade. So it takes a lot of energy. And we must burn metabolic heat in order to do that, meaning that the energy budget of endotherms is enormously more wasteful than that of ectotherms. And the greater the difference between the outside environment and the inside preferred temperature, the greater the energy cost. So, homeotherms in particular have a number of adaptations to minimize heat loss, and guess what? We've seen them before. This is countercurrent circulation. We have blood shunting, in which blood vessels near the periphery of the organism can just be kind of shut down, so that although they have lower blood supply, they also lose less heat. This is very common in aquatic animals that dive in cold water. They frequently have shunts that bypass the skin and reduce heat loss through the skin. And then there's good old countercurrent circulation. And here's an example of a bird that might be in, say, cold conditions, and here it's got its foot on ice. And so the ice is about 0 degrees, and the blood circulating in the foot is quite cold, but because we lay the outgoing warm blood from the artery next to the incoming cold blood from the vein, we have heat exchange from the artery to the vein, which carries heat back into the body and reduces the amount of heat that is lost in the foot.